Good evening and welcome to our first English language podcast. Tonight, our guest is Professor Emeritus Sergio DellaPergola. Professor DellaPergola is the undisputed world authority on Israeli and Jewish demographics. You might think that this is just another statistics to add to an already gruesome war, but it isn't. To understand Israeli demographics right now is not just to understand the forces at play in this terrible conflict, is to go way back and understand the construction of the state of Israel, the divisions between the various populations that inhabit it, whether they're Israelis or Arabs. To understand Israeli demographics is also being able to map out the future of the country in the years and the decades to come. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Rush and Laufer podcast. This morning, we are very pleased and honored to have our guest, Sergio DellaPergola, Professor Emeritus of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and who is widely considered the world authority on demographics in Israel and at large of world Jewry, which is a very complex matter because the Jews are moving about at rapid pace and are living in so many different countries in the world. It's very difficult to keep track of them. And to define what is a Jew, I would maybe at a later stage would like to have the opinion of the dear professor to tell me if I am to be considered as a Jew, for instance. So this is a very complex matter. The tragic days that are now engulfing Israel, demographics are probably more important than ever. The news and the reports coming out of Israel are only focusing on the death toll, on the amount of bombs used, on the declaration of this or that minister, on the hysteria on that side or that side. However, very, very little news are devoted to this crucial, absolutely crucial aspect of the entire, not the war, but the situation in the region, which is demographics. Because it is said in the denomination of Israel that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Jewish is, of course, something about religion, about people, and about history, but nowadays, it also very much means something about demographics, and it would be very important to have a very informed and insightful look on that particular topic. So this is why we're very happy to have you, Professor. Just for the viewers to say it, you and I have met a year and a half ago when I was in Israel following the beginning of the war. I found our discussion very stimulating, and I'm sure that our viewers today will also find your views, as it was for me, very surprising and sobering, I would have to say. So my first question would, of course, have to do with the news and the actuality. We know that in Israel per se, if I exclude the West Bank and I exclude Gaza, there's about 9 million people, out of which 7 million Jews and 2 million Arabs and others. Since the beginning of the war, so now almost 2 years, has this proportion changed whatsoever?
Yes. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy with the opportunity. The data have to be updated a little bit. The total population, legal population of the state of Israel by the Israeli law surpassed 10 million in 2025. And of these, about 500,000 are Israeli residents of the West Bank. Include them or not, Legally, they are Israeli citizens, and so that they are submitted to the Israeli law. In any case, then we have roughly 2.3 other 2.3 7.3 millions of Jews. The addition of the 500,000 in the West Bank makes for about 7.8 millions on the Jewish side, and so 1.3 millions more or less on the Arab side. This is the state of Israel, excluding, therefore, the Palestinian population in the West Bank and excluding those in Gaza. The numbers, by the way, for Gaza and the West Bank are not completely agreed. There are different versions because the last census was in 2017, but there were some problems in definition of who is a resident of the West Bank and Gaza. My own bet would be that in Gaza there are slightly more than 2 millions. Maybe we shall return to that later. And in the West Bank, something in the 2.6, 2.7 millions, making the total of the Palestinians in the Palestinian territories something around 4.8 millions. And so this total of 10 plus millions Israelis plus nearly 5 millions Palestinians. The point is that we approach a total aggregate of about 15 millions, and between the river and the sea, or between the sea and the river, as you see it. And this is unprecedented. This is quite amazing. It points to a very high amount of population. So besides the questions related to the conflict, it's a very complex. The equation is not only a matter of numbers, but also a matter of the proportion, because as you mentioned, Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, the question is how much Jewish and how much democratic. And this is related to defining the territory and defining the population which pertain or do not pertain to a certain definition of Israel. As you are aware, there is a conflict and there is a big debate, but we also have the official data. The authority in this case is the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics, and so this is what we can say. In the state of Israel proper, that is excluding the West Bank and Gaza, but including the Jews who live in the West Bank, there are no Jews in Gaza besides the military forces, which is a contingency to no residents. But taking the legal population of Israel, there are about 80% or slightly less, around 79% who are Jewish and 21% who are Arabs. This includes East Jerusalem. We have to cope with the fact that the Israeli consider East Jerusalem as part of the state of Israel, as well as the Golan Heights, where the population, though, is modest. East Jerusalem is a substantial number of several hundreds of thousands. In brief, you have a state of Israel with a Jewish majority approaching 80%, with the further caveat that about 5% of these 80% are not really Jewish. They are members of Jewish households, not considered Jewish by the rabbis, but they are sociologically integrated in the Jewish neighborhoods and in the Jewish sectors of society. Who serve in the army, they pay taxes, and they are in fact not recognizable. I mean, the distinction between those who are actually Jews by religion and those who are Jews by some other definition is nearly impossible to do in the field. You can do it, of course, in the registers of the rabbinate. So this is basically the fundamental equation. Israel approaching an 80% Jewish population. On the other hand, going back to the total population from the sea to the river, then the proportions are quite different. You factor in nearly 5 million Palestinians, and so the proportion is nearly 50-50. It is 1% on the Jewish side, but to describe the situation is nearly half and half, and so that's of course the.
Okay. May I ask for precision on this figure? Thank you very much. I think this helps very much to understand better the the dynamics. There have been some reports. I've seen that last year that a significant number of Israelis, without specifying whether they were Jews or non-Jews, left in the first half or in the first quarter of 2024, mostly because of the economic situation. Many people were working for startups on the on the coast near Tel Aviv to continue their business or to relaunch their business elsewhere. Do you have any?
We have very accurate monthly data on migration, immigration, and out-migration. In fact, what happened in the last year is quite outstanding. I must just add one technical detail. Immigration is calculated once a person has left the country and has not returned after, let's say, a period of 9 months. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, there are so many tourists who travel and people who go around. So you have to wait some amount of time to decide that the person is now currently abroad. And so the final balance is obtained roughly 1 year later. So we know those who departed in 2023 and during the first half of 2024 and have not yet returned once we have reached the half of 25. Now, in this during the last year, for the Israeli migration balance was negative. Usually, and I can say over the last 100 years, the international migration balance of Israel was positive. That is, Israel got more immigrants than out migrants, with 4 exceptions: into 1925, 1952, 53, 4, and now 2023, 2024. That is 4 times over 100 years means that this is quite exceptional. But the number has also to be observed carefully. The negative balance in during the last, the last negative balance that we have for the last year is about 20,000. This is the negative difference between those who came in for the first time or returned after having been abroad, and those who left and did not yet return. Now, a negative balance of 20,000 is exceptional. I repeat, 4 times over the last century. But if I take other examples of countries under trouble, let's say the international balance of Ukraine during the period of the last 2-3 years, runs into the millions, not into the tens of thousands. And so this means that the negative balance is a fact. The amount of it is relatively modest. Then, of course, the question is what is happening now day by day. The latest data I have looked at are from the month of April 2025. We continue to see a monthly balance, but it is rather modest. So it's somewhat less than it was during the year, which was significantly affected by war. Once again, the details are important. Strongest monthly negative balance was in October 2023. Now remember, in October 2023, Israel was under attack. There was a massacre in the south, something unprecedented in the history of the country. So look at the numbers of departures. In fact, 10 to 15 people, 10 to 15,000 people left in 1 month. That's quite amazing. Some of them were temporary residents, some of them were students. So the fact is that it was quite exceptional. But if I look at that in an international perspective, honestly, I think the numbers are rather small. So it's negative, but it's very small. And it depends then mostly on what will happen in the continuation of this very troubling situation. militarily, and above all, economically. I believe some of you already mentioned that the economy is truly important as a determinant of migration. That's the case in Israel as well. Let me say that in the general perception, Israeli migration is understood as a fundamentally an ideological fact. You know, people want to go to Israel.
If I may just step in here, I think it's important that you explain that to, because this was for me one of the most important lessons that I learned from it from the last time. It came to me as a shock. And I think I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for the general public in the West listening to this program, but also for Jews themselves who do not understand that all the time. So if I can say the mechanism of Zionism.
It is interesting because there is a mechanic kind of analytic component, but also a kind of philosophical, generically ideological dimension to this discourse. And so it has to be made very clear what is the importance of each of the components. My impression, and I am quite an early observer of the scene. Incidentally, I was in Jerusalem during the Six-Day War, and I was in Italy during the Holocaust and World War II as an infant. So I was there. And I can tell you that in general, Israel is perceived as a kind of odd entity, which, unlike other countries, mostly operates in function of ideologies and religion and the attraction or repulsion based on ideas and values. And of course, there is a very important component attached to that. But then the demographer looks at socioeconomic indicators and at population measures. And we discover that most of the explanations can be related to a sort of normalcy. That is, Israel as a nation, not unlike any European nation and any other nation. Israel is rather developed. It pertains to the most developed sort of 25 countries in the world. So it has to be compared with certain countries and not with other countries. But when you look at migration, for example, everybody thinks that people will go to Israel because they wish to be in a religious environment. They think of the religious future of their children. They also think of social networks. They wish to be Jews among other Jews. And this is unquestionably true. But the number of migrants who go to Israel is statistically related to socioeconomic indicators in the countries of origin. And so if you ask me, for example, how is that the number of Jewish immigrants from an important country, an important community like France, 1 year is such and such, another year is 2 or 3 times higher, and then it diminishes very sharply and so on. I mean, there are significant fluctuations in the numbers of immigrants from France, from Italy, from Sweden, from the US, from Australia. Then you look at the possible explanation and you find an incredibly strong correlation with the rate of unemployment in the country of origin. Now, of course, the different countries have different economic developments, and so they are not completely synchronized. One country does better 1 year, and the other country does better on another year. They have developments also in terms of the number of migrants, which are not simultaneous. 1 year you get more from France, another year you get more from...
And you say it is more connected to economic developments in the country of origin than to anti-Semitic incidents, because what we hear very often in government or politicians' language is it is because of anti-Semitic acts that they go to Israel.
I would not neglect the effect of anti-Semitic acts, but I have checked. I cannot tell you this year and next year because I don't have yet the data. But if I compare the last 10, 15 years, and if you follow me on a sort of statistical reasoning, the amount of explanation that comes from the economy is 7 to 8 times stronger than the amount of explanation that comes from anti-Semitism. I'm saying it's not that anti-Semitism does not explain anything. It does. but the economic explanation is definitely much.
But I think if I can just step in and explain a little per bit of family history. My grandfather was a German Jew. He was born 1901, so by the early, he was in his early 30s, and he was a high-level government. Now, a high government official meant that he felt that his position was at stake as a professional. So 1932 arrives, and then 1933, and he says to his wife, "We have to leave." Why? Because of anti-Semitism? Well, yes, but because his job was threatened. If he stayed, he knew for sure, because they were talking, all these officials, he knew he would lose his position. And then what? And then, well, maybe try to be a lawyer, but he will face the same problems. Obviously, he was a smart man, and he did a dual PhD in Germany and Holland, and I'm very proud of him. But he also was warned not by pure hatred, by the economic consequences of hatred on him and his family. And you gave me last time a fascinating example about the bombing of a synagogue in Argentina in 1994, where dozens of Jews were brutally murdered, and that led to very little consequence in terms of emigration of Jews of Argentina. But like a few years later, the National Bank of Argentina collapsed, and then all the Jews left to Israel.
Well, not all,
not all, but like yeah.
But again, there were a few hundreds who left after the 1994 bombing of the AMIA building in Buenos Aires, and more than 6,000 in 2002 after the collapse of the National Bank. It is a factor of about 7 to 8 times higher. By the way, the example of your ancestor is very interesting because, in fact, it confirms the complexity of a combination of reaction to discrimination and considerations that are more related to life cycle profile and mobility and careers. Now, of course, let's go back to the extreme. The situation of brutal and massive persecution, that's the extreme. At that point, people really have no choice. They try to leave. By the way, already happening or perceived as to going to happen very soon. Here the question is whether they can do it or not. In Germany during the 1930s were sometimes opportunities, but then very strict limitations. People were trapped, and people could not go anywhere else because there were quotas and laws strictly limiting the access of Jews. They could not go to the US, they could not go to Palestine, besides small numbers, they could not go anywhere else. And so they were trapped, and so they were killed. So this is a situation where, in theory, there is a potential for mass immigration if the opportunity is given. Let's take, though, another evenience which is relevant these days, and that's the war between Russia and Ukraine. Here we have something utterly surprising, because, in fact, most of the immigration to Israel since March 2022, again, has come from Russia and Ukraine. It was so in the 1990s, and then again over and over. But the most recent 3 years are quite amazing. In fact, about 2/3 of the total immigration to Israel comes from that area. But now listen to this. You would think Ukraine is suffering because it has been somewhat...
I'm sorry. 2/3 of the immigration comes from where?
From the combined total of Russia. But nearly all of it comes from Russia, not from Ukraine. You would think that people in Ukraine are fearful, and there are certain areas where there is war on Ukrainian ground, and so people move away. And in fact, many Ukrainians, Jewish and mostly non-Jewish, have left the country and they have redistributed elsewhere. Most of the immigrants come from Russia. In theory, is a country where there is less danger. So we have to analyze this. My propensity is to consider, first of all, one factor, which is quite obvious, the likelihood that young people would be enlisted in the Russian army, probably something that many would prefer to avoid. The other thing is to understand very clearly what happens in the Russian economy and also in other avenues of social mobility and opportunity, including maybe latent discrimination, not open, but latent discrimination. And so people leave. So these are the data. We, the analysts, have to face the data. The fact is that most immigration to Israel during the last 3 years has come from the Russian Federation, and which means, of course, that situation of war is beyond the economy, or perhaps the economy underlies what is going on underneath.
Maybe it could be connected also to the Western sanctions against Russia, which is making it much more difficult for certain businesses to operate in Russia, and therefore they moved elsewhere. I was ambassador in Turkey until the end of 2023, and we have seen a similar phenomenon whereby many Russians and also Ukrainians came to the region of Antalya. Another reason why you have more Russians than Ukrainians is that, of course, Ukrainians were welcome with open arms in Western Europe. So they could also go to Germany, France, and other places like that. Whereas for the Russians, the options are much more limited.
Yeah, well, in the case of Jews, we have some data, very imperfect, on the number of Ukrainians who go to Germany, for example. Jewish community in Germany has a good kind of statistical registration system, which is not complete, but it gives some idea. And of course, the best system is in Israel. We perceive, however, that there is something going on in Russia which prompts a much higher tendency of the Jews in Russia, besides the fact that the Jewish population in Russia is about 4 or 5 times, probably 4 times bigger today than the Jewish population in Ukraine. But the proportions among immigrants are quite different. So anyhow, into account all that has been said here, I tend again to put the focus on certain rational thinking relate to opportunities and risks and needs, and rather than on pure ideology. Now, of course, since Israel has a very open immigration law for Jews, and it opens the doors to Jews, the children of Jews, the grandchildren of Jews, the spouses of all of those, whether Jewish or not Jewish, it offers an opportunity which does not automatically exist in other countries, each of which has a law on immigration and citizenship, of course.
Yes, may I ask a kind of fundamental question? 80-20% ratio between Jews and non-Jews. Not already some kind of principle or standard that was set by Ben-Gurion at the beginning of the State of Israel? That's one question. And the second one is it important to maintain this ratio, and can it be maintained over time with the current natality rates and demographics?
Well, going back to Ben-Gurion, no, I don't think so. Ben-Gurion made a strategic choice, saying that there must be a Jewish majority. He did not specify what majority in the beginning. By the way, in 1948, the moment of declaration of independence, it was really a shot in the obscurity. The Jews barely had the majority in the territory allocated to the Jewish state at the moment of declaration of independence. Then the War of Independence developed. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left the area, thus creating the problem of the Palestinian refugees elsewhere. Some of them went to the West Bank, which was allocated to the Arab state by the United Nations at that time. But there was no majority of 80-20. It was much lower. The majority was immediately after created through the mass immigration of Jews who came, that is, the survivors of the Shoah, and the Jews from North Africa and from the Middle East. All of this drastically changed the proportions in the demography of the Jewish state of Israel. Then during the war of 1948, 1949, the boundaries changed somewhat. Israel occupied and then annexed certain areas that were originally allocated to the Arab state. So the Arab majority, the Arab minority within the state of Israel became what it was. At the beginning, it was about 10%. After the flight of the Palestinians as a consequence of the war, then started becoming gradually eroded because, as you hint, the natality of the Arab Israelis was much higher than the natality of the Jews in Israel. So Jews had more immigration, the Arabs had more births, and this proportion diminished all the time. There were moments of more and less. The immigration from the Soviet Union in 1991 was a moment of change, but eventually we get to this 80-20. Now, looking at the moment, this 80-20, perhaps surprisingly, is not bound to change significantly, because in the meanwhile, mostly recently, birth rate, fertility rate, which is the average number of children, and the birth rate, which is the number of children actually born minus those who die, they have become quite similar in terms of Jews and Arabs within the state of Israel. And so in projections that I made, I have this proportion slightly fluctuating over time, but not changing radically. The longest term projection is to 2050, or maybe slightly beyond. And at the moment, it is bound to remain roughly as is. Contrary to what we could think a few years ago, I had myself a big paper predicting that the Jewish majority would be eroded. I don't think so anymore.
But isn't it so that these new developments are related to the very high birth rate among the ultra-Orthodox population, which is not too very well included in the economy, which is not doing military service? Will that not produce some significant consequences in the social, economic, and political structure of Israel in the next 30 years? We may be faced with a situation where 40 to 50% of the population by 2050 will be either Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel, or ultra-Orthodox, and this will create new challenges. Is it not so?
You're perfectly right. And I have a long paper, quite recent, I don't think David has seen it, explaining exactly what you just said in broad strike. It's true. So we are now talking of two different issues. One issue is the Jewish Arab majority minority, which is stabilized. Now we have a second issue, which is the internal composition of the Jewish population, its productivity, its insertion in what we call usually civil society. In Israel, civil society willy-nilly also includes military service. Military is not civil, but it is, in fact. The military are all civilians. And so the big question is now a question of integration, coherence, and if I may sharpen mutual respect and tolerance between the different components of the Israeli society. This is a big issue. By the way, the moment we are talking, there is a sort of internal crisis in the Israeli government, which is produced by the strong request by the very religious parties, which are an essential components in the Netanyahu coalition, to pass a law which will exempt definitively the young Haredim, the young very Orthodox, not talking of women, from military service. And on the other hand, evident in a situation of war, every day young Israelis die In battle, it is very difficult to propose exemption to a significant sector of tens of thousands of potential people who might participate in the effort. It is not sustainable. So the government has a big difficulty at passing the law. But if the law does not pass, it might be a government crisis. So you see how precarious. But now let's move to the other point. The other point is also interesting. Military service. This is the economic inclusion of these sectors of society. I'm talking of the Haredim, of the very religious. I just open a short parenthesis saying that the Arabs are getting gradually more inserted in the economy. This is, I would say, a very remarkable process, which is visible at many levels of society, especially in medicine, in services. It started very late, but it's now moving very, very fast. My humble opinion, in a very positive, when incorporation and equality are the essentials of democracy. Going back to the Haredim, the big question is whether eventually they will be part of this process of inclusion, and they will therefore participate more actively in the economy. There are certain symptoms that, yes, this is happening very slowly. Academization, for example, besides studying religious studies, learning secular professions, law, especially technology, and so getting into the economy, becoming more productive, getting out of poverty and subsidies that the government at the moment provides. So these are the big questions. I would say, yes, this is happening. The crucial question toward 2050 will be to see how much this has actually happened. And if this actually happens, it might be that the birth rate of these sectors will diminish somewhat, not spectacularly. Don't expect 2 children in a Haredi family. But the difference between 7 and 5 is
significant.
It is significant. And so then at that point, we shall have to reconsider also the balance of Jews and others. So as you see, there are many incognitae in this equation.
But there is something also, because you were mentioning the dynamics of population in Israel. There are no exact figures. What I've heard so far is that the war since October 2023 is costing the Israeli economy anywhere between $200 and $300 million a day. There is a growing movement in the West, but also in America, wean support for Israel, both economically and militarily. We know that there was a speech by Netanyahu, like a few weeks ago, where he addressed the Knesset and said, we will have to learn to not depend on American military support any longer, which sounds a little bit like wishful thinking.
There is an old joke, the donkey and the proprietor every day used the portion and the donkey lived until one day the donkey died. So this, you can reduce the daily amount of food, but at some point
the donkey died.
So I don't buy. I absolutely cannot buy. Israel is absolutely part of the global system, to some extent dependent on the global system, significantly so from the US. It also has very significant economic relations with Europe and with Asia. But no, Israel cannot think for a moment to be isolated. And so if you wish to be a bit extreme, strong sanction would certainly put Israel in a very weak position immediately. And then you can think of the longer term. Think that investment diminishes and the high tech reduces and the universities lost budgets. So this will certainly increment the pressure to emigration. We spoke already of emigration, especially of the elites. And so if you take away not millions, but several hundreds of thousands of key people from an economy, that economy suffers enormously. Instead of being the 20th or the 25th more developed country in the world, and you become the 45th or the 50th, it has an additional kind of spiraling. So one has to be very careful about politics and of course B declarations.
I have a kind of sensitive question, maybe, because we have heard the statements of many of your far-right politicians, and also all the discussion about the so-called Riviera in Gaza. And it seems that many, there are some people who are in the government who are thinking of massive changes in the demographic structure, at least of Gaza, maybe in the West Bank, through humanitarian expulsions, if I may put it this way. The problem being, of course, that they don't know where to send those people, and that they don't ask for their opinion, even though they speak about voluntary departures. Is there a demographic reflection behind that, saying we will, and I've heard that from some Likud members, we will be able to live in peace and stability between the river and the sea only if there is a sort of massive expulsion or massive rebalancing of the demographic situation?
We are talking with someone who has a radically different view. I'm not responsible for the lunatics who sit in the government.
But they exist.
They are a part of the government. As long as this government governs, they may be influential. But first of all, clearly Israel cannot do anything alone. By the way, President Trump is the one who launched the idea of the Riviera. It is not an Israeli idea. So let's also clarify that we are part of a debate in which there are other actors. If some of these actors are lunatics, I really have very little to say. I don't see the feasibility of anything of this. You must also consider that at the moment, the government of Israel has a support of about 35% of the voters. There are weekly electoral polls in Israel. So at any moment, an election would give certainly a totally different. The present government would go into the opposition by a very significant margin. Although it is also true that the opposition is divided, it is not clearly easy create a package of a functional, efficient, and quick decision maker, new government. But in any case, the declarations of those extreme fringes, they are self-supporting. They do not represent the public opinion in Israel. Now, what is feasible is, of course, that, and this requires an effort by many factors who at the moment are not yet involved or are not willing to be involved. There has to be reckoning with two things. Terror has to stop. And so Hamas cannot continue to govern Gaza with the genocidal declarations as they do, because every day a soldier dies in Gaza. The war is continuing, and it means there is a huge amount of TNT in Gaza being used against the Israeli soldiers. If it is not used against the Israeli soldiers, it will be used against the Israeli civilians. So this cannot continue. On the other hand, we must respect the sufferance of the millions of Gazan inhabitants, and we must think of a serious plan of reconstruction. The plan of reconstruction must happen with the active participation of the moderate Arab governments of the area, of the Europeans. I must say that Europe is totally non-existent at this level, and of a willing American government which goes by rationality, as they did in Europe after defeating the Nazis in 1945. They did not build a Riviera without the Germans. They rebuilt Germany. That's the difference.
What about the political perspective that one day to accommodate these 7.5 million Jews, 7.5 million non-Jews between the river and the sea. This is the basic equation. What is the political formula do you believe which could be successful?
The first step is separation. The idea of one multinational country is unrealistic. There is one country which I personally love, but that's my own personal affinity, and it is called Switzerland. Switzerland is a multicultural country, and they have found the formula to put together different languages and different religions. We must understand the Swiss had made a decision to be together and to find a common goal. This is not the case in our situation. So the separation is much better. Take the case of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was eventually separated. Take the case of Sudan and South Sudan. Take the case, there are so many cases which...
even Czechoslovakia.
And Czechoslovakia. The Czechs and the Slovaks did it with high class and without bloodshed. And
there is separatism in Trentino Adige.
Not so much, but Alto Adige, yes. So they found a way to find a kind of super autonomy, which is the best of all possible words for the inhabitants of Bolzano-Bozen. So in this case, first of all, we are not at the level of political maturity of the Swiss. We are still at a much older stage. So first of all, division and separation. Second, the question is, and here I have my own opinion, whether 2 states for 2 people or a different configuration. I personally, and that's my idea, I already wrote this about 15 years ago, Gaza must be autonomous and the West Bank must be autonomous. That is, these are 2 different entities, geographically separated, anthropologically different, culturally different, politically hostile. There is a civilian war between the West Bank and Gaza going on. We remember what happened once Hamas took power in Gaza in 2007. So why put together 2 things which are incompatible? So the state of Gaza, the state of the West Bank, and the state of Israel in between, exactly like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Don't forget, Pakistan and Bangladesh were once upon a time Pakistan. And then Pakistan, there was a war between East and West Pakistan, and finally Bangladesh became a state. India is the big thing in between, and the 2 smaller ones, one to the left and one to the right.
Interesting comparison.
But this is without counting on the settlements.
The settlements, of course, have to be part of a grand plan of peace. Regarding the settlement, my opinion, I mean, we can look at different scenarios realistically, because again, lunatics on the one hand and lunatics on the other hand are very nice to produce maybe a panel on TV, but looking seriously, it doesn't help very much. And so, first of all, one consideration about the settlers. There are 3 types of settlers. Type 1 is those who simply were seeking for an apartment which was slightly cheaper in the outskirts of the big city. In the outskirts of Jerusalem, there is a city called Ma'ale Adumim. And in the outskirts of Tel Aviv, there are places you simply get a very nice apartment and you spend maybe 1/3 less. Why not? So that's type 1. Type 1 has no ideology. They simply look for cheaper housing. Type 2, they have an ideology, but they say if there is peace, I must be removed from my home. I will pretend to get a compensation and I will go away. There are even senior politicians in Israel. One of them is Lieberman, who lives in the depth of the West Bank. But he spoke of territorial exchange. He spoke of all sorts of changes, adaptations of boundaries. And so he would accept some arrangement that compensates his current housing. Type 3 are those who will in no way give up. Not only that, I fear that some of will pick up a gun and we will fire against the Israeli troops, will try to send them somewhere else. So we have to cope with type 3. Type 3 is several thousands or maybe a few tens of thousands of people. It's a minority. Let it be clear. The problem is that this minority has a significant stake in the current government. They are represented in the current government by Ben-Gvir, to some extent by Smotrich, and these are two powerful associates of Netanyahu. Needs them because Netanyahu cannot go to the opposition. Netanyahu will be finished the day he loses the election, and so he wants to postpone by all means. So this is kind of perverse situation, but I think we are not free from doing this kind of sociological, typological analysis and making distinctions and say that there are solutions. And then there are extremists who are against any type of solutions. This, of course, is the case of Hamas, and we have our own Hamas, and hopefully we can cope with it.
It will require a lot of political will to achieve, I think, the vision you have mentioned, which I had also written about in an article I wrote last year based on the calculations and some statistics made by Shaul Arieli, whom you know probably.
I know very well, and I overall think he's perhaps the best expert on the typology and minutiae of the West Bank. I must add, though, that unless there is also a strong willingness of democratic societies to propose democracy in this region, and it will be more difficult and slower. And I don't see that. I see that Western democracies do not believe in their democracy, and so they do not propose it to others. They stay aloof, and so situation doesn't improve very much.
David, can we extend a little bit the conversation to the global equation related to demographics? Because we see sometimes a very dramatic fall of the birth rates in many Western countries, Western or Asian countries. I mean, Korea is 0.9. Is my mathematics correct that it means that every generation they will lose 50% of their population?
That's correct. In the long-term projection, if you don't have a total fertility of 2, actually 2.1, in the long term, your population will decline. So this is the extreme case in South Korea. Some countries in Central Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, countries who are member of the European Union, are also below 1.5. They lose in the longer term millions or tens of millions.
It's very sharp. It's going very quickly. It's like within 25, 30 years, you feel the consequences. If you have a 1.5, for instance, it means you lose 1/4 of your original population in 25, 30 years.
Exactly so. So if Italy loses something like 15 million Italians, then the question, just to give one example, that's my country of birth.
Switzerland has exactly the same issue.
So you get a situation where you face a choice. Reduce the productive system proportionally, and so you produce less cars, less milk, less Coca-Cola, less clothes, or you try to keep constant your population, so to keep the productive system going on, but you need the manpower, where you have to import from elsewhere. The suppliers of manpower are fundamentally, I mean, the easiest is Africa and the Middle East, then in fact Asia, and even to some extent countries in Latin America. And so it's technically feasible, however, culturally very complicated, because you have to import people who are different, first of all, in terms of religion and language and culture, and then tragically so, sometimes also in terms of their physical appearance, which stimulates brutal racist reactions among some part of the population. So, I mean, but there is no third avenue. You either keep your population going on or you face these problems. Some countries have tried to incentivize the birth rate. The results are very dim. The northern countries, the Scandinavians, have done better than the southern countries. They have given huge support and incentives to families. You get 1 year premium after a birth, 2 years premium. The husband is also gets a premium, and not only the woman. So they keep it going, but even in the north, they don't reach 2 children. And then the United States is also going. So that's so crucial and so critical. I don't see easily a way to overcome, because eventually people have children as a consequence of fundamentally 2 variables. One is resources. People and resources are relative. That is, you may have the resources, but you think you should have more, and so you are never happy. And the other thing is optimism. I hope there is a future. Why should I bring a baby in a world that has no future? And so this is a perverse. The resources are so and so. In fact, there has been a dramatic improvement in resources since the 2000s. Now less because of the war, but Israel has made really a big jump forward. Jews and Arabs as well. There are gaps, but everybody has improved. And then the optimism, which may look a bit about surrealistic and illogical, but every survey internationally shows that there is still a lot of optimism in this area. The birth rate continues to run. There has been a slight decline, but still we are around 3, slightly below 3, which is quite amazing. I not only because of the very religious. You take, to conclude, the lowest administrative division in Israel, which is the Greater Tel Aviv municipality, and you have a fertility rate of maybe 1.9 or 2, which is higher than any country in Europe. And Tel Aviv is the lowest in Israel, the most secular, the most alternative, the most anti-conformist, you name it.
And this explains the very high price of real estate. I think it gives us a very insightful vision of things that, as I was hoping from the beginning, very different and very more practical, but also more useful than the reports that we usually have come from the West, who like to emphasize on hatred and bombs and not actually take care of the deeper dynamics at play. You have done a very good job at laying it out for us who are laymen in these areas and do not understand much. But I think we now, at least for myself, I have a much better picture. Jean-Daniel?
No, thank you very much. I especially like that you finish with a call for optimism and making babies.
That's what everybody should hear.
Thank you, Jean-Daniel. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor.